We didn't know what we were hunting until we saw the biggest shadow we'd ever seen. The phosphorescent wake stretched across the dark Pacific like a silver highway, and through the periscope of USS Archerfish, I watched something that shouldn't exist cutting through the night waters. November 28, 1944, 2300 hours. The moon was new, which meant the darkness was our ally, but it also meant that whatever was out there was running without lights in complete blackout conditions. I whispered, not taking my eye from the scope, "Chief, get Captain Enright up here." Now, I'm Lieutenant Commander Joe Enright, and I'd been hunting Japanese shipping lanes for 6 months aboard the Archerfish. We were a Balao-class submarine, 311 feet of American steel and determination, carrying 24 Mark 18 electric torpedoes and a crew of 81 sailors who'd volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the Navy. Submarine service in 1944 meant a 20% chance you wouldn't come home. But it also meant we were the tip of the spear, cutting deep into Japanese waters where no surface ship dared go. The war was turning our way. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines. The Marianas had fallen, but Japan still had teeth, and somewhere in these dark waters, their fleet was moving with deadly purpose. 3 days earlier, we'd received orders from COMSUBPAC, Commander Submarines Pacific, to patrol the shipping lanes southeast of Japan. Intelligence suggested major Japanese naval movements, but the details were sketchy. What we knew for certain was that something big was happening, and our job was to find it and sink it. The sonar operator's voice cut through the red-lit darkness of the conning tower. "Contact bearing 090, range approximately 12,000 yards. Multiple screws, big ones, sir." I adjusted the periscope, sweeping the horizon. Nothing visible yet, but sonar doesn't lie. Something was out there, moving fast through waters that should have been empty. The Japanese had been conserving fuel and avoiding unnecessary fleet movements since their devastating losses at the Philippine Sea in June. Whatever was making those sonar contacts had to be important. "What's the sound signature, Peterson?" I called down to our sonar operator. "High-speed screws, sir." "At least 4 escorts, maybe more. And something else. Something I ain't heard before. Real deep engine noise. Whatever's in the middle of that formation is big, Captain. Real big." Commander Enright appeared in the conning tower, still pulling on his jacket. At 34, he was young for a submarine captain. But he'd earned his dolphins the hard way, through 3 war patrols that had sent 7 Japanese ships to the bottom. "What have we got, Joe?" he asked, taking the scope from me. "Sonar contact, bearing 090. Multiple vessels in formation. High speed, maybe 16 knots. They're running blacked out, but Peterson says there's something unusual about the engine signature." Enright pressed his eye to the periscope and began his own sweep. The Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions, black water under a moonless sky. But submarines hunt by sound as much as sight, and our ears were telling us that history was approaching through darkness. "There," Enright said suddenly. 085. "I've got silhouettes." I took the scope back. At first, I saw nothing but the gentle swell of the Pacific. Then, like ghosts materializing from the night, I began to make out shapes on the horizon. Dark forms cutting V-shaped wakes through the phosphorescent water. My heart started hammering as I counted them. 4, 5, 6 escorts, I reported. Destroyers, maybe a cruiser, all running in formation around. Almighty. In the center of the formation, illuminated by its own wake and the faint starlight reflecting off its massive hull, was the largest warship I'd ever seen. Even at 12,000 yards, it dominated the horizon like a floating mountain. Its flight deck stretched longer than 3 football fields, and its superstructure rose like a small city from the sea. "Captain," I said, my voice barely steady, "I think we're looking at a carrier." "A big one." Enright took the scope and studied the contact for long minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of recognition. "That's not just any carrier, Joe. Look at the size of it, the proportions. I think we're looking at one of those supercarriers intelligence has been talking about." Maybe the Shinano herself. The name sent a chill through the conning tower. Shinano, Japan's newest and largest aircraft carrier, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull. American intelligence had been tracking her construction for months, but she was supposed to be safely in Japanese home waters, not running blacked out through open ocean. If that's Shinano, I said, she's probably carrying a full air group. Maybe 100 aircraft. Not anymore, Enright replied grimly. Peterson, what's their course and speed? Bearing 210, speed approximately 16 knots, sir. They're heading southwest. Southwest meant the Philippine Sea. Southwest meant they were heading toward the American invasion forces that were consolidating their hold on the islands. A carrier the size of Shinano, loaded with aircraft and veteran pilots, could devastate our amphibious forces and prolong the war by months. Battle stations torpedo, Enright ordered. The command echoed through the boat, and suddenly the Archerfish came alive with purpose. Sailors moved with practiced efficiency through the narrow passages, checking systems, loading torpedoes, preparing for what might be the most important attack of our war. I moved to the plotting table where our navigator, Lieutenant Morrison, was already calculating an attack solution. The mathematics of submarine warfare are brutal in their precision. Speed, bearing range, torpedo run time, everything had to be perfect, because we'd only get one chance. They're zigzagging, Morrison reported, plotting the target's course changes, standard anti-submarine pattern. Base course 210, but they're turning 15 degrees left and right every 6 minutes. Zigzagging was smart. It made it almost impossible for a submarine to predict where a target would be when the torpedoes arrived. But it also meant the Japanese knew they were in dangerous waters. They were expecting us. Range to target? Enright asked. 11,000 yards in closing, sir. Still too far. Our Mark 18 electric torpedoes were deadly, but they had a maximum effective range of about 4,000 yards against a high-speed target. We needed to get closer, much closer, and we needed to do it without being detected by those 6 escorts. Take us to periscope depth. All ahead 1/3. We're going to trail them and wait for our chance. For the next 2 hours, we shadowed the Japanese formation like a wolf following a herd. The Archerfish moved silently through the water, her electric motors whispering instead of roaring, her crew speaking in whispers. Every few minutes, Enright would raise the periscope for a quick look, checking their position, their course, their escorts. The tension in the conning tower was thick enough to cut. We all knew what we were looking at, probably the most valuable target any American submarine had ever encountered. Sinking Shinano would be like destroying an entire air base, complete with aircraft, pilots, and support equipment. It would be a blow to Japanese naval aviation that they might never recover from. But we also knew the odds. 6 escorts meant dozens of sonar operators listening for the slightest sound. Depth charges meant instant death if we were detected. And even if we got into attack position, we'd have to hit a moving target with unguided torpedoes while avoiding detection by some of the most experienced anti-submarine crews in the Japanese Navy. Contact is zigzagging again, Peterson reported from sonar. New course 230. Morrison worked frantically at the plotting table, trying to predict the carrier's next move. Submarine attacks require perfect timing, launch too early, and the torpedoes miss ahead of the target, too late, and they miss astern. With a zigzagging target, the margin for error was almost zero. They're turning toward us, Morrison announced. If they hold this course, we might get a shot. Enright was already at the periscope, watching the massive formation change course in the darkness. Range 8,000 yards. Still too far, but they're coming to us. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. The Japanese formation continued its zigzag pattern, and slowly, inevitably, they drew closer to our position. At 0300 hours, sonar reported the range at 6,000 yards. They're turning again, Peterson called. New course 190. This was it. The geometry was finally right. If the Japanese held their new course for just a few more minutes, we'd have a perfect setup for a torpedo attack. range 5,000 yards, Morrison reported. Flood torpedo tubes 1 through 6, Enright ordered. Open outer doors. The sound of flooding tubes and opening doors seemed impossibly loud in the silent submarine, but our crew had practiced these movements thousands of times. Within seconds, 6 Mark 18 torpedoes were ready to launch, their electric motors armed, their warheads primed. Bearing mark, Enright called, still peering through the periscope. 087, I replied, reading the bearing indicator, range 4,000 yards. Angle on the bow starboard 15, speed 16 knots. Morrison's hands flew over his calculator, working out the firing solution. Speed, bearing, range, torpedo speed, target course, all the variables that would determine whether we lived or died in the next 10 minutes. Solution ready, sir, Morrison announced. Recommend firing bearing 092. Set torpedo depth 10 feet. 10 feet would put our torpedoes just below the surface, running straight and true toward the waterline of the massive carrier. If they hit, the explosions would tear huge holes in her hull below the armor belt, flooding compartments faster than her damage control teams could respond. Set depth 10 feet, Enright confirmed. Final bearing and shoot. I made one last calculation, checking Morrison's work against the target's position. The carrier was huge in the periscope now, her flight deck clearly visible even in the darkness. She was so large that missing seemed impossible, but I'd seen too many attacks fail because of small errors in calculation. Bearing 092, I confirmed. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered slightly as the first torpedo left its tube, followed quickly by 5 more. All torpedoes running hot, straight, and normal, Peterson reported from sonar. Time to target 2 minutes 30 seconds. Now came the longest wait in submarine warfare. Our torpedoes were racing through the dark water at 46 knots, but it would take nearly 3 minutes for them to reach their target. 3 minutes during which the Japanese might detect us, might change course, might launch depth charges that would crush our hull like an eggshell. Take us deep, Enright ordered. Emergency dive to 200 feet. The Archerfish angled downward, seeking the protection of deep water. As we descended, I could hear the distant sound of the Japanese formation passing overhead, the deep thrumming of heavy engines, the higher whine of destroyer screws, all mixed together in a symphony of naval power. 1 minute to impact, I announced, watching the stopwatch. Sonar contact bearing 040. Peterson called suddenly. High-speed screws, closing fast. I think one of the escorts is coming your way. My blood turned to ice. If a Japanese destroyer had detected our torpedo wakes, we were dead. Depth charges at close range would crack our pressure hull and send us to the bottom in seconds. 30 seconds to impact, I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Contact bearing 035, range decreasing. Definite destroyer, sir. 15 seconds. The tension in the conning tower was unbearable. 81 American sailors holding their breath, waiting to see if their attack would succeed or if they'd be detected and destroyed before they could find out. Impact. Now, I whispered. For a moment, nothing happened. The ocean wasn't except for the approaching destroyer and the sound of our own systems. Then, carried through the water like distant thunder, came the sound we'd been waiting for. Wham! The first explosion lit up our sonar like a lightning bolt. A few seconds later, the second torpedo hit. Wham! Then the third. Wham! Multiple hits on target. Peterson shouted, his voice breaking with excitement. 3, maybe 4 direct hits. Through the hull of the Archerfish, we could hear the sounds of a ship dying. Massive secondary explosions as aviation fuel ignited, the groan and crack of steel bulkheads failing under tremendous pressure. The roar of inrushing water flooding compartments that had never been designed to be breached. Breaking up noises, Peterson reported, his voice filled with awe. She's going down, sir. The big one is going down, but we weren't safe yet. The destroyer was still closing, and now it was joined by others. The Japanese escorts had realized what had happened, and they were converging on our position with deadly intent. Depth charges in the water, Peterson yelled. The first pattern exploded about 500 yards away, close enough to shake the submarine, but not close enough to damage us. The Japanese were firing blind, trying to bracket our position with enough explosives to kill us even if they couldn't see us. Boom, boom, boom. The explosions came in rapid succession, each one closer than the last. Light bulbs shattered, and loose equipment flew across the compartment. But Enright kept us moving, changing course and depth, trying to slip away from the hunters who were desperately trying to avenge their dying carrier. "She's still breaking up," Peterson reported between explosions. "Massive structural failure. I'm hearing hull plates hitting the ocean floor." Through it all, we could hear the death throes of Shinano. The largest aircraft carrier in the world, converted from a battleship hull that was supposed to be unsinkable, was breaking apart and sinking to the bottom of the Pacific. Her aircraft, her pilots, her enormous potential for destruction, all of it was disappearing beneath 3 miles of dark water. The depth charge attacks continued for another hour, but they were growing more sporadic and less accurate. The Japanese destroyers were running out of depth charges, and we were slowly working our way out of the search area. By 0500 hours, the ocean had grown quiet again. "No more sonar contacts," Peterson reported. "I think we're clear, sir." Enright ordered us back to periscope depth. Through the escape, I could see debris scattered across the surface of the Pacific, life rafts, pieces of decking, oil slicks that reflected the first light of dawn. But of Shinano herself, there was no sign. The greatest aircraft carrier ever built had vanished as if she'd never existed. "Secure from battle stations," Enright announced. "Set course for Pearl Harbor. We're going home." The crew's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cheers echoed through every compartment of the submarine as the news spread. We'd done it. We'd sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine, dealt a crushing blow to Japanese naval aviation, and lived to tell about it. But as I stood in the conning tower, watching the debris field drift past, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. Shinano had been a magnificent ship, the product of thousands of skilled workers, and representing the pinnacle of naval engineering. And now she was gone, along with most of her crew. War is like that. Victory comes at a terrible cost, even when you're on the winning side. Every ship we sank carried sailors who had families, dreams, hopes for the future. They were our enemies, but they were also human beings, and their deaths weighed on us even as we celebrated our success. Over the next several days, as we made our way back to Pearl Harbor, the full significance of what we'd accomplished became clear. Intelligence reports confirmed that we'd sunk Shinano, Japan's newest and most powerful aircraft carrier. She'd been carrying a full complement of aircraft and some of their most experienced pilots. Her loss was a devastating blow to Japanese naval aviation at a time when they could least afford it. More importantly, Shinano had been heading toward the Philippine invasion fleet with orders to disrupt our amphibious operations. If she'd reached her destination, the invasion might have been delayed by months, costing thousands of American lives. Instead, she was resting on the bottom of the Pacific, her aircraft and pilots silenced forever. The Japanese tried to keep the loss secret, but word eventually leaked out. Shinano, the ship that was supposed to turn the tide of the war, had been sunk by a single American submarine on her maiden voyage. It was a propaganda disaster for Japan and a tremendous boost to American morale. When we finally reached Pearl Harbor on December 15, 1944, we were greeted as heroes. Admiral Nimitz himself came aboard to congratulate the crew, and the story of our attack made headlines across America. We'd struck a blow for every American who had died at Pearl Harbor, every Marine who had fallen on the beaches off the Pacific, every sailor who had gone down with his ship in the dark days of 1942. But the war wasn't over. Japan still had fight left in her, and the final battles would be the bloodiest of all. Kamikaze attacks would intensify. The invasion of Okinawa would cost 200,000 lives. And always hanging over everything was the possibility that we might have to invade Japan itself, with casualties that could reach into the millions. Looking back now, 79 years later, I can see that the sinking of Shinano was more than just a tactical victory. It was a symbol of how the war had turned. In 1942, Japan had seemed unstoppable, their carriers ranging across the Pacific at will, their aircraft dominating the skies. But by 1944, we'd learned to fight their kind of war, and we were winning. The Archerfish and her crew were just one small part of that larger victory. We were 81 sailors in a steel tube, hunting in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. But we were also representatives of an entire nation that had been shocked into action by Pearl Harbor and had responded with a determination that our enemies had never imagined possible. We built more ships than they could sink. We trained more pilots than they could shoot down. We developed new technologies, new tactics, new weapons that gave us advantages they couldn't match. And when we met them in battle, whether in the air over the Marianas or beneath the waves in the shipping lanes around Japan, we fought with a skill and courage that honored all those who had died before us. The Pacific War would end 9 months later with the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Japan would be occupied, rebuilt, and eventually become one of our closest allies. The men who had tried to kill us would become friends and trading partners, proof that even the bitterest enemies can find common ground in peace. But on that November night in 1944, as we watched Shinano disappear beneath the dark waters of the Pacific, we were still at war. And our job was to win that war as quickly and decisively as possible, regardless of the cost. The hunt for Shinano lasted less than 6 hours from first contact to final attack. But those 6 hours changed the course of the Pacific War and demonstrated once again that in war, as in life, it's not the size of the dog in the fight that matters, it's the size of the fight in the dog. We were just one submarine crew, but we carried with us the hopes and determination of an entire nation. And on that night, that was enough.